pleased to be presenting to you Harry McAllister's Pikes Peaker this morning. Let's go ahead and dive right in. The Pikes Peaker is a periodical that was created by 8-year-old Harry McAllister in 1880. This is one of the copies that we have. We have 2 copies. We have November 7th and November 20th. It started in August 20th, and if we do the math on the volume numbers and the numbers that were created, he apparently was creating one of these a week. Even while he was going to school and doing his chores and maybe recreating outdoors a little bit and milking the cow, he was creating one of these a week. Take a look at this, and you can see that on this volume we can see lines going across. So he took a ruler. This is done in pencil. We can see up here on top the volume number, the dates, the Pikes Peaker. This was very well organized. Each one of these paragraphs is basically an article. There were columns that were personal or local interest or national interest. This first one that we have, which is November 7th, is following up the national election. So 1880 was a presidential election year. It occurred on the 2nd of November, and so this is just the following week. And we can see a bunch of information that expresses the joy that the family was experiencing at the win of the Republican candidate in this particular election. 1880, as similar to 1876, was a very contentious presidential election, and so this would have been a big deal for the McAllister family and a big deal for Colorado Springs, the state of Colorado, and the nation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. When I start to look at the articles that he wrote in the periodical and some of the information that's being conveyed, I begin to think as I'm researching about the different ways to interpret this document. One way to interpret the document is it's a great snapshot of Colorado Springs history. Details, small little things, mundane, domestic, economic details, and we glean some fantastic information as a snapshot of history. The other way to look at this document and interpret it is as a family document, because what this document was designed as was correspondence with family in Philadelphia and keeping a connection between the Colorado Springs McAllisters and the Philadelphia McAllisters. So apparently what he would do would be he would make one copy of this, he'd fold it up, he would send it to one relative, and then that relative would pass it along to other relatives in the area, and that would be the Philadelphia metropolitan area. So it's a really neat document, but much of my interpretation is as a family document and looking at what would have been of concern to the McAllisters and their family back east, what they would have talked about, what sort of things would have been in conversation around the dinner table, those sorts of things. And so here they are. This is the McAllister family, circa 1874, standing outside their home at what is now 423 North Cascade. At the time it was 419. They owned the half of the block. And this is Major McAllister standing right here holding 2.5-year-old Harry McAllister. And next to him is Elizabeth, his wife, and she is holding a few-month-old Mary McAllister. And then a year and a half later, Matilda McAllister would come along. Great picture. It's interesting that the McAllisters are kind of standing in the background with the house, not drawing attention to them. We don't have very many pictures of the McAllisters. This is one of the few that we have of the family, even though we're missing Matilda. There's Harry. Harry was born in Philadelphia, and then about the time that he was a year old, the family moves to Colorado Springs. So our understanding of 1-year-olds, he probably thought of Colorado as his home and Colorado Springs as his hometown. He dies in 1954 in Denver, a very successful lawyer. He represented El Pomar and the Penroses, Winfield Scott Stratton Estate, the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway. He was a very successful transportation and natural resources lawyer in Colorado. So one of the first articles that I'd like to take a look at really revolves around this nice snapshot of Colorado Springs. He's an 8-year-old boy. He's not going into great detail in these articles, so it takes a little bit of interpretation. In my research, I'm looking at the Gazette and other periodicals to see the veracity of what he's talking about, how exact and how accurate the articles that he's writing are. So I'd like to show you one here quickly. This is in the November 7th edition, which is number 11, and Major McAllister has organized the Society for the Encouragement of the Cultivation of Fruit in El Paso County. The Gazette refers to this as the Pomological Society, and the Gazette also refers to Major McAllister as being in a good position to begin this society because of the success that he's had planting apples on his property at 419 North Cascade. They must have planted those almost immediately. They were living on the property as the house was being finished, and so they probably started landscaping as they were living in a shanty next to where the house was being built. So they'd had a number of years, about 7 or 8 years, before he starts this pomological society. And apparently he had had great success. The Gazette article says it's as good apples as you can get out here in Colorado Springs. Now, Major McAllister is starting these societies or these clubs not for social purposes, but for civic and economic purposes. He had started the Horticultural Society a number of years previous. So what he's looking to do is diversify the economy, right? So this has civic function as well as economic function. This one is a little bit more domestic or mundane if we talk about history, but for us it's really neat. This is Harry, and he refers to all of his family members and everybody else in their formal names, and he's reporting that Mary McAllister, his sister 2 years younger than he, had been sick this last week. Pretty exciting stuff, right? But as we know, in 1880, getting sick could be a little problematic, and we want to get them healed up very quickly. And it's a great window into Mrs. McAllister's skill in being a person that's kind of leading the domestic charge. And take a look at the one misspelling that I've found in the entire, and that is 2 L's in bilious. I admit, I had to look up the word. This is not in my vocabulary. It means having to do with vomiting. That's the definition, and he did misspell it. He included a second L when he shouldn't have, so maybe we can blame the McAllisters for their editing, but they missed that one. And this is what's just a lot of fun, is Mrs. McAllister put a mustard plaster on her breast and feet, and in the morning she was just fine. So now I have to go out and buy some mustard plants and put it in our herb garden so I can create a plaster and we can try it out, right? So this is some of the fun, sort of mundane history that we're getting out of this document. That we're enjoying very much. Other types of articles in the Pikes Peaker have a little bit broader ramifications, and the way I interpret some of these articles, again, is as the importance and significance of the family. So a lens into the life of the McAllisters, what their interests, values, ethics were, sort of what we would be talking about if we were sitting around the dining room table with them or in front of the fire in their library, what their lives were like, what was of interest to them, and what they would want to share with their relatives back east. Remember that this is an internal family document. This isn't meant for public distribution. This is from the November 7th issue, and like I mentioned, that is just following a few days after the national election, presidential and congressional. So we've got a big portion of it that is dedicated to the election. Everything on the screen is referring to the election, and we've got these neat little illustrations that were cut out from the Gazette and then put on there to express their joy, the family's joy, a little bit of patriotism, and then illustrating this battle, very contentious battle between the Democrats and the Republicans, just as contentious basically as the 1876 election. It was a significant election in our country's history. So we've got interest in this at the local, regional level, Colorado, the state level, as well as national, but the family was very interested, and I'll touch on that in just a couple moments. So in November 7th, Harry, in this relatively long article, I'll remind you, this is an 8-year-old that is writing this in pencil and cursive, and I'm giving you quotes here so you can see the sort of language that he was using. On November 7th, he's commenting that Colorado went Republican. And that it's very interesting to see that the election results took a long time, probably the longest in Colorado because of the rural communities that were getting tallies in, but mountainous and the weather, right? So probably even more difficult than your big rural sort of communities, Colorado. So it took about 2 weeks for the results to get into officials. They were very excited about the results, as was the city. And then we've got these comments about the weather. It was a very, very cold and snowy year, 1880. Already by November, some records had been broken. November 21st, Harry is commenting about the contentious nature and the divide in the nation, particularly the Congress. The two houses were very evenly divided as far as the vote, and it's interesting that at 8 he's making this comment, it's not likely, therefore, that many laws will be passed. Some of these articles we will start to think, is he talking about 2019, 2020? We see some cyclical history here in these articles. So just a little bit, because this was such a big part of the article that he's writing on November 7th, and then he comments it on the next one, just a little bit about the presidential election of that year. So post-war era, Reconstruction, we've got a lot going on. The winner of that election is James Garfield. The loser in that election is Winfield Scott Hancock, and that's very significant because this is a very interesting election for the McAllister family and for their relatives, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. A little bit more about this election. The electoral vote was not very close, but the popular vote was extremely close. Now, I've since done, I have to qualify this because I've since done some more research on the actual total vote, and I have to admit that I think that this is not accurate. There's contention about what the numbers of that vote were, and it looks like it's anywhere from about 40,000 total votes to a low of this, which is 4,000. So I apologize. I think that this is probably an error, but it's somewhere between, of 8 million people voting, the total difference was somewhere between 40,000 or less votes. So very, very close election. And we'll talk about the significance of that in just a moment. But here's what I wanted to point out. Did everybody notice this? Winfield Scott Hancock is from Pennsylvania, which is where the McAllisters were from and where their family was from. And then it gets a little bit more interesting when we take a look at the map. These visuals are always so great. For those of you that know where Philadelphia is, take a look and try to just picture the metropolitan Philadelphia area with New Jersey going Democrat, Philly going Republican, basically, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. So all of this surrounding area, we have this political divide, right, that would have been experienced by the McAllister family. After all, they're from Delaware, so they may have even had relatives that were voting on different sides of these issues. There we've got Colorado, which was very significant in establishing itself. This election was as a Republican state, and the Gazette basically is stating that Colorado Springs is the stronghold of this new Republican state. So another set of articles by Harry, switching gears here a little bit away from the election, are articles that have to do with Lucretia Mott's death. And Lucretia Mott passing would have been a very significant event for the McAllister family and for their friends and relatives back east in the Philadelphia area. I'll explain a little bit more about who Lucretia Mott was and what she accomplished in her lifetime. But this particular article is talking about the Mrs. Thomas Parrish of the city, who is Lucretia Mott's granddaughter. So we have a couple in Philadelphia that was married in Philadelphia, living in Colorado Springs at the time, and that's Thomas C. Parrish and his wife Frances Cavender. They got married in 1868 in Philadelphia. At that time, the McAllisters were living in Philadelphia also, but the significance of this is that Thomas Parrish's grandfather is Edward Parrish, who was the first president of Swarthmore College, and Frances Cavender's grandmother was Lucretia Mott. So this is somewhat of a power couple, at least as far as their relatives go, and I'll explain this connection just a little bit. The McAllisters would have been interested in both of these families and most likely were familiar with them. So a little bit about Lucretia Mott and her passing. Her passing was not only significant to the McAllisters, but to Colorado Springs history. And this is some of the things that she accomplished in her life. Down here at the bottom, I'll point out she was one of the co-founders of Swarthmore College, and she was the driving force insisting that it be co-ed. So this is a Gazette article on November 21st, the same date that number 13 comes out and that Harry is referring to her passing. Take a look at the title, of this article, The First Woman in the Country. So if we look at the language that's being used in the 1880s, the way we interpret that statement is that she was the woman of the 1800s in the United States. Her significance was extreme. And the characteristics due to Folger blood. So Folger blood is referring to Benjamin Franklin. So we've got a family here that has Lucretia Mott and Benjamin Franklin in their family. It's quite a line. Edward Parrish, as I said, was the first president of Swarthmore College, and Swarthmore is significant to the McAllister family and to their relatives, and I'll tell you why in just a moment here. But he was the driving force both in the co-education but in the liberal arts curriculum, emphasizing sciences and faithfulness to Quaker simplicity. At the dedication ceremony of what is to become Parrish Hall a little bit later, the first building on campus, Edward Parrish makes this statement which very much rings true for a student of the McAllister family. Looking at education as fitting for men and women, not simply for business, but it should fit them for life with all of its possibilities. So Swarthmore was significant in these connections to the McAllisters. They were in Philadelphia at the time that Swarthmore was chartered and grew, and they probably were observing this from afar, reading articles, knowing people that were co-founders of it. And the reason that it has significance a number of years later is because both Harry and his sister Mary attend Swarthmore College. So the fact that it was a co-educational college was obviously significant for Mary McAllister, but for the family itself. This is a reflection of the emphasis of education by this family, both informal and formal educations. Basically, this document that we're calling the Pikes Peaker is an education for Harry McAllister. We don't know if it was demanded by his parents that he create this document or if it was suggested. Clearly, it was a family project for him to produce this much on a weekly basis. It was probably something that was worked on by all the members of the family, and including possibly his younger sister, Mary McAllister, who might have been the brightest of all of them in the family. This is her thesis from college, Swarthmore College, and it is on the growth of Goethe's Faust. She was really the scholar of the family. She attended what is now Palmer High School, as did her brother, and she was the valedictorian of her senior class. She delivered the valedictorian speech in Latin to that. So she might have been showing off a little bit, but she was pretty bright, well educated, and that was due to this family education that Harry was experiencing also. And so we've got this on display in the museum, and we're very proud of that. So I return to the family here, this very nice, interesting family living at 419 North Cascade that valued education so much, and we're so thankful to have the Pikes Peak around today so we can get a little glimmer into the family and the emphasis they placed on education and their values and ethics.
In a presentation a couple of years ago on the NORAD Cheyenne Mountain Complex, at this symposium, I referred to Robert Heinlein's 1966 science fiction novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. In that particular novel, the loonies, who were enslaved people on the moon, launched rocks to destroy the NORAD command center. That was just a little brief part of the whole presentation. I knew that Heinlein had lived here in Colorado Springs at the time that he wrote that particular novel, but not much more about him or how Colorado might have influenced his writing. Today, I want to give you a whirlwind tour, and it really be a fast one, of Heinlein's life, and I will identify 4 physical intersections, as I call them, between him personally and Colorado's Pikes Peak region. The last of those intersections, the 4th one, being 17 years as a resident here in Colorado Springs, his most productive literary period. Robert Anson Heinlein was born in Butler, Missouri on July 7th, 1907. And before he was even a year old, his parents moved the family to Kansas City, where he spent the rest of his childhood, teenage years, and graduated from high school. You'll note in the picture at the bottom, in the front row, there's Heinlein with his ROTC uniform, a member of the Shakespeare Club. His graduation picture's the upper right, and he's the little boy sitting on the ground when the children were playing some sort of cowboys and Indians, I guess. Heinlein's first intersection with Colorado came in July 1923. Now remember, he was born on July 7th, 1907, so when he came here, he was 15 years old. He turned 16 here in Colorado Springs. He and a friend had decided to take the Colorado Flyer from Kansas City to Colorado Springs, and they spent the entire month of July. They started off in Colorado Springs, visiting the first evening the Garden of the Gods. Then they hiked up Pikes Peak, and they went to Green Mountain Falls. And we don't know where he went from there, but for the rest of that month, they did a lot of camping and hiking in Colorado's high country. And they wound up in Denver at the end of July. He had 50 cents in his pocket. And so he spent 25 cents for some donuts that got him back to Kansas City, and the other 25 cents was for Hugo Gernsback's August edition of Science and Invention. Now, Heinlein had been doing a lot of science fiction reading, H.G. Wells and others like that, but this was a particularly important magazine for him. This was the first pulp magazine that we know of that was completely dedicated to scientific or science fiction. And that was a very special thing for him. He remembered it all his life and told stories about buying that magazine at a Denver newsstand. 2 years later, Heinlein graduated from high school in Kansas City and got an appointment at the U.S. Naval Academy, and he graduated there in June 1929. While he was on graduation leave back in Kansas City, he renewed acquaintance with a high school classmate that he'd known, Eleanor Curry. You see her on the right. And he was only on leave for 2 weeks now, but they married after just a couple of days together. She slept with a different person on her honeymoon. She refused to take his last name. And then when he was ready to go to his first duty station out in California, she said that she liked her job in Kansas City too much. She wasn't going to go to California with him. So that marriage didn't last very long. They had a divorce, but in those days you had a 1-year waiting period, after the divorce papers were filed. So it took him a while. I mean, he couldn't marry another woman so quickly. But he went to California, and his first duty station was on the aircraft carrier USS Lexington. The Lexington, of course, was destroyed later in World War II. But in January 1932, out there, he was with a friend in Pasadena who introduced him to a new girlfriend. And her name was Leslyn McDonald. She was an actress. She was working in the Pasadena Playhouse and doing some other things and writing poetry and that sort of thing. So that was January 1932. The very night that he met her on his first date, he slept with her and asked her to marry him. And so they had a formal marriage in March of 1932. 3 months later, Heinlein reported to a new duty station in San Diego on an old destroyer that you see in the lower right there, the USS Roper. And he was a gunnery officer on that particular ship, and they spent a lot of time out at sea practicing the gunnery actions, and he started to not feel very well. He got very, very ill, almost died, and finally, by December 1932, the Navy doctors had figured out that he probably had tuberculosis, among some other diseases. Meanwhile, there you see his second wife, Leslyn, and Robert. That's a 1940s picture. And so, in the era of that time, tuberculosis patients in the military were all sent to the Army Hospital, Fitzsimmons Army Hospital near Denver, Colorado. So that was his second intersection with this area. He arrived there in September 1933 because it took him quite a few months to get well enough that they could transport him to Fitzsimmons. And Leslyn, meanwhile, found a room nearby in Aurora's War Mothers National Memorial Home. You see it in the lower left there. Colorado Springs was fairly advanced in its treatment of tuberculosis during this period compared to Fitzsimmons. Fitzsimmons was still using an old mechanical treatment known as the pneumothorax treatment. You see it in the lower right there. And this involved, pumping the fluid out of the lungs, compressing it to get it out of the lungs over and over and over. It was a mechanical treatment that was pretty medieval, I think. But eventually he improved enough that he could go on outpatient status. So he and Leslyn, when he was on outpatient status in Denver, met John and Alice Garrison. Now, they helped the Garrisons found the Colorado Springs Sunshine Club. Have any of you ever heard of that? It still exists, by the way. It was a nudist sunbathing club. As it turned out, Leslyn and Bob were able to leave before 1935 when the Garrisons and others were arrested, and there were newspapers all over the country carrying this story about the rest of the nudists in Denver. So they felt very fortunate that they'd escaped in time. He also got involved, somehow, was contacted by a Pendergast machine politician from Kansas City and a gangster who had been making a lot of money during Prohibition on selling illegal liquor. And they wanted to invest some of that money more healthily in a silver mine up west of Denver. And so Bob said, I'll be the front man and I'll go up and test the ore. He assayed the ore himself, and he invested all of his savings in this silver mining venture. And then when the Navy finally decided that they were going to medically retire him in March of 1934, he went back to Kansas City to collect on his investment. But when he went to the lawyer's office to get the reimbursement, the lawyer was just distraught, and he says, well, didn't you know, this particular gangster, didn't you know he was killed in front of the hotel last night? And so Heinlein lost his entire investment. The mining adventure was really an adventure. And the couple went back to California. By autumn of 1934, he and Leslyn, and incidentally, Leslyn was a registered Republican, but they became involved in the politics of California in 1934 with Upton Sinclair, and a very liberal Democratic candidate he was. He was running the campaign, the EPIC campaign, End Poverty in California. And of course, the Republicans against him were accusing him of being a socialist. My wife, Kathy, said it was kind of Upton Sinclair was kind of the Bernie Sanders of 1934. Then, after his own unsuccessful campaign to run for the California Assembly in 1938, Heinlein decided that he needed a different kind of career. And he decided on writing science fiction, and he sent his first story, called Lifeline, to the editor, John Campbell, of Astounding Science Fiction magazine, which had just been founded a little bit before that. And this was April 1939. He published his first science fiction story. And then over the next 2 years, he published 16 more short stories and a serialized novel in Astounding that later on became the book's 6th column that I'll talk about a little later. And a few of those stories were published under various pseudonyms, like Anson MacDonald, from Robert Anson Heinlein and Leslyn MacDonald, and Lyle Monroe. I don't know where he came up with that particular pseudonym, but he was publishing these things so fast, and sometimes he'd have 2 of these stories in the same issue of the magazine. So he became so well known as a science fiction writer and so popular in those 2 years that rapid rise led to his invitation to become the guest speaker at the 3rd Colorado World Science Fiction Convention, otherwise known as the Denvention. And that was held on the 4th of July weekend in Denver, Colorado, and at the Shirley Savoy Hotel. The Heinleins drove from California. They spent a little bit of time here in Colorado Springs because Leslyn hadn't been here, and Bob wanted her to see the Garden of the Gods and see Pikes Peak. And then they checked in to the 4th floor of the Savoy Shirley Hotel, and their room became sort of a pre-convention hospitality lounge, especially for a lot of teenage boys. There were a couple of dozen teenage boys that he said, went through the cokes like crazy and things like that. And he gave a speech based on H.G. Wells and future history, and became very popular. But some of the teenage boys thought that he was a little too inflated in his ego, and so they started giving him a hard time at the convention, and that affected him severely for the rest of his life. He did not like to take that sort of criticism. But he was on a high roll until World War II came along, and he didn't produce anything from 1942 to about 1946. During the war years. It definitely curbed his literary production, but he and other science fiction writers, and you see 2 of them there, L. Sprague de Camp and Isaac Asimov, worked with him at the U.S. Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia. And there, Robert and Leslyn, during the war, became friends with a young lieutenant chemist, Lieutenant Virginia Jenny Gerstenfeld. We'll hear more about her as we go. At the war's end, the Heinleins returned to California. Bob submitted his resignation immediately after the Japanese surrendered, and said, he had to go back to California, and he renewed his science fiction writing almost immediately. Meanwhile, Leslyn had developed a depression, and that's a whole other story. And she became, like her father, an alcoholic. And Bob tried to hide it from his friends, but it didn't work. She just deteriorated and showed a lot of mental psychosis as well. And then, to make matters worse for him, at least initially, Jenny Gerstenfeld showed up at their door. She had been discharged after several months of the war and had decided to come to Los Angeles because her boyfriend, who lived in Berkeley, California, had decided he didn't want to have anything to do with her anymore. So she was going to go to Los Angeles to UCLA to study an advanced degree in chemistry. The result was that Robert wound up ultimately divorcing Leslyn, and he and Jenny became lovers. Now, Jenny was a champion skating dancer. She and this partner that was up in Berkeley had won many awards. But Bob took up skating with her, and you see them there in that picture doing ice dancing. They agreed to make Colorado Springs their home, and they settled initially at the house on the right, 1313 Cheyenne Boulevard. Bob arrived at the beginning of September 1948, and Jenny came just a week later. But Bob's divorce from Leslyn wasn't official until October 20th of 1948. To avoid scandal, therefore, the couple went on to Raton, New Mexico, where they married on October 21st of 48. Heinlein's publishing of short stories proliferated in the Springs. Most during this period were juvenile stories for teen boys, as were some of the books that he published in the late 40s and early 50s. And there you see a few of the covers of those. References to Colorado became very common in these stories. In Space Cadet 1948, he said, Interplanetary Patrol Cadet Matthew Dodson sat in the waiting room of the Pikes Peak Catapult Station. In a story called Poor Daddy in Calling All Girls magazine, we read, Daddy sent back cards postmarked Green Mountain Falls, Colorado. And in sixth column, the book version of the serialized earlier edition, we find the little scout car hovered over Lookout Mountain a few feet from Buffalo Bill's grave. And The Man Who Sold the Moon in 1950, I intend to make Colorado Springs the spaceport capital of the world. We hold the franchise of the old cog railroad now. And then in 1950 came Destination Moon. And in the upper right-hand picture, this was an award-winning film that he worked on the scripting of it, as well as special effects. And in the upper right-hand corner photo, you see Heinlein with spacesuited usher Bud Criswell at the Chief Theater in Colorado Springs before the showing of his film. And in the center upper part are Jenny and Bob on the set of Destination Moon. He also, in February of 1952, was featured in Popular Mechanics magazine and the Gazette-Telegraph for the house that he designed at 1776 Mesa Avenue. And the article talked about a lot of the innovative features in this new home. He later would add a bomb shelter, which would inspire the book Farnham's Freehold in 1964. A second movie script didn't do so well. Project Moonbase was kind of a flop in 1953. But if you watch the two together, you can see a lot of differences in the films, and it really enhances Destination Moon. He went on with adding Colorado references in The Door into Summer in 1956. I'm quite aware that the way my wife and I are dressed, or not dressed, would call for explanation under some circumstances. These are the grounds of the Denver Sunshine Club. Remember the nudist club? And in Farnham's Freehold, he could make out against the black sky the blacker blackness of the Rocky Mountains. And of course, in The Moon was a harsh mistress. For a century, North American Space Defense Command had been buried in a mountain south of Colorado Springs, Colorado, a city of no other importance. For that particular statement, or at least for the book, he won a Hugo Award from the World Science Fiction Convention. And then in 1958, there was a big controversy in April. There was an ad by the Statement of Americans in a Nuclear Age, SANE, in the April 5th newspapers, Sunday morning. And Robert and Jenny responded with their own ad on the right, the heirs of Patrick Henry, the Patrick Henry League, where they were favoring continued nuclear testing. Two controversial novels followed based on some of that experience, and Heinlein got a Hugo Award for each one of those in 1959, 1961. But Jenny was suffering at that point from altitude sickness. They didn't realize it at first, but she grew weaker and weaker. And so they decided in 1965 that they had to go to a lower altitude and leave Colorado Springs. So they went to Bonnie Doon near Santa Cruz, California. And Bob designed a new house. Some call it the Space Saucer or Flying Saucer. And that's where they spent the rest of their lives. Before he died on May of 1988, Heinlein published in 1987 a science fiction memoir reflecting on his own life in Colorado. And in there, we find references like, well, now I'm having Manitou water with a trivet. Or, have you visited the Broadmoor Zoo? And a posthumous Grumbles from the Grave on the right in 1989, edited by his widow, where we hear, sometimes I think everyone in the country passes through Colorado Springs in the summer. I don't even intend to write a story in Colorado Springs again between June 1st and September 1st. So, in the end, these are the books that I spent reading over the last 8 or 9 months to determine the influence of Colorado Springs. And in the lower, longer line are all the books that have references to Colorado Springs or Colorado or the Rocky Mountains. Sometimes just one, sometimes the whole storyline is built around that. The upper, shorter ones are the ones where I couldn't find a single reference to Colorado. But I do think, and I think further research would suggest, that his 4 intersections with Colorado had a tremendously important impact on this great science fiction writer, one of the 3 greatest science fiction writers most people think, along with Arthur Clarke and Isaac Asimov, that have ever lived. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be able to present this material today. I'm going to preface this really quickly with, I know I've talked to some people that are architectural experts here. I'm largely a migration, I study migration history mainly, but I focused on these individuals who all happen to be architects, so I had to learn a lot about architectural history and architectural terms. So I say that as an apology for any mistakes I might make or any misstatements I make about architecture, because I know there's architectural sticklers out there. Also, I am not a trained photographer, and so a lot of the pictures you see are pictures that I took, and so I apologize for any bad pictures you might see as well. This one here being one where this house is under construction, and so there's garbage out in front of it. On August 3rd, 1901, Thomas MacLaren penned a letter entitled, "To the Citizens of Colorado Springs of the Year 2001, an account of the architecture of the city at the above date. This likely from his office in downtown Colorado Springs or from his beloved El Paso Club, just 3 blocks to the north." MacLaren's letter provided a balanced and detailed assessment of the built environment of the young city, with praise and criticism for existing structures and those responsible for their design and construction. The letter also provided insights into the talented young architect's thoughts on architectural design, form and function, and the relevance and importance of architecture and its, quote, unconscious but nonetheless effective good influence in molding the character of the people. A native of Scotland and a highly trained and credentialed architect, MacLaren immigrated to Colorado Springs just 6 years before his letter was included in the Colorado Springs privately funded community time capsule in 1901. MacLaren was not alone as a newly arrived immigrant to the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. The region was quickly growing with an influx of both domestic and foreign migrants who were lured by mining opportunities, the resort-like amenities of Colorado Springs, and the purported healing qualities of the high, dry Rocky Mountain air. Among those immigrants who would also become prominent and active residents of Colorado Springs, and with whom MacLaren would form close personal and professional bonds, were the Scottish-trained architects Walter Farquhar Douglas and Thompson Duncan Hetherington. Individually in partnership, MacLaren, Douglas, and Hetherington would design or contribute to the design of much of the most important residential, commercial, and ecclesiastical architecture in Colorado Springs. Indeed, architecture representing an enduring legacy between Colorado Springs and the birth of the arts and crafts movement in Britain. So here are these 3 gentlemen, MacLaren, Douglas, and Hetherington, left to right. They were all educated, trained, and began practicing architecture in Scotland prior to their emigration, which occurred between 1883 and 1893. And what I find fascinating about these individuals is that they were all born within months of each other. They all were born into wildly different families and circumstances and raised differently. They all found themselves into the profession of architecture. They all found themselves in Colorado Springs right around the same time, and they all partnered with each other and created this architecture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them here. MacLaren certainly is the most prominent and well-known of the 3. He was born to a very wealthy family in the southern part of the Scottish Highlands. As a young child, or as a young boy, teenager, he followed his brother James Major Banks MacLaren to London. James studied architecture also, and he studied architecture at the University of Glasgow, moved to London to begin his practice, and Thomas followed him there and began studying architecture as well. He was known as a student and a designer with boundless potential. He won a number of awards as a student, and then after actually starting his profession, he was awarded some of the profession's most highly esteemed awards. So no doubt, before he came to Colorado Springs, he was something of a rising rock star in the architectural world. Douglas, also a Scotsman, was actually born in Madras, India. His father was a colonel in the colonial army, and the family actually moved back to Edinburgh, which was Colonel Douglas's home city, when Walter was a young boy. He was raised there. They settled in the posh west side of Edinburgh, a family of considerable means as well. Not much is known about his training as an architect or his education, but we know he started his architectural training because he was noted in the 1881 Scottish census as an apprentice architect. Hetherington, also a Scotsman, like Douglas, was not born in Scotland. He was born in Ontario, Canada, which was still a British dominion. So he was a Scotsman, consider him a Scotsman, but he was born in Canada. Just a few months after his birth, his father passed away. His father was a druggist. They were a family of very modest means. And the family moved back to Scotland, settling in the southern Scottish town of Newton Stewart. At that point, the family kind of broke up and lived in different homes. The two times I found him located in the census, he lived in 2-room homes with up to 10 people, so a family of very modest means. Again, not much is known about his training or his education, but he also is noted in the Scottish census as being an architect in 1881, or apprentice architect. So with their apprentice training beginning in the late 1870s, McAllister, Douglas, and Hetherington were thrust into a profession responding to a new approach to art that would become known as the arts and crafts movement. Originating from the words and works of 3 British intellectuals, Augustus Pugin, John Ruskin, and William Morris, the arts and crafts movement was a philosophic counteraction to many of the modern ills that plagued 19th century Britain. Influencing and affecting artistic mediums of nearly every type, the arts and crafts movement was a reaction against the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the landscape, on people's lives, and on the end products of mechanized industry. As it applied to architecture, this reaction meant reconnecting the artist-designer with the craftsman-laborer, a return to Gothic or traditional design, a reintroduction of naturalism and vernacularism through the use of locally sourced building material and styles that are congruent with the natural environment, and a simplification of form, practicality, and use. In its purest form, arts and crafts architecture was not a specific style of architecture, but rather an approach to design. Now, it's not known what work Douglas or Hetherington might have done before they emigrated to the United States, but if the early professional success of MacLaren was any indication, then great things were to come. MacLaren established his own practice in London prior to his emigration, and a couple of his sketches seen here, Oak Lawn at Crawley Dowell, and then also Horn Vicarage at Surrey were his first 2 commissions that he completed. He completed one other in Scotland, actually. This is on George Street in Doon, Perthshire, Scotland, and that's just south of the family estate or land where Thomas MacLaren was born. Now, each of MacLaren's British works showcase Scottish and British arts and crafts characteristics such as asymmetrical balancing, regionally influenced brickwork, crow-stepped gables, rough-cast harling, and wide-arched openings. Contemporaries of MacLaren, Douglas, and Hetherington included architects whose names became synonymous with the arts and crafts movement in Scotland and in Britain. Architects such as Charles Harrison Townsend, Robert Stoddart Lorimer, William Richard Letheby, and most notably Charles Rennie Mackintosh. All of these architects who I just mentioned were actually influenced by the pioneering work of Thomas's brother, James Majorbanks MacLaren. So MacLaren himself was influenced by his brother, as were all of these architects who became synonymous with arts and crafts architecture in Britain and Scotland. These are works. This is J. Majorbanks MacLaren's works for Sir Donald Currie in Fortingal, Scotland, and these would become known as some of the earliest and most influential examples of arts and crafts vernacular style in Scotland. Soon after arriving in Colorado Springs, MacLaren, Douglas, and Hetherington quickly reestablished their work. They may never have referred to themselves as such, but they were certainly architects working in and influenced in the arts and crafts tradition. They were schooled in Britain, which was the cradle of the arts and crafts movement, and upon their emigration, they did not abandon these tenets. And this could be seen in both their words and their works. For example, in 1900, Douglas wrote an article that was published in Colorado Springs Mountain Sunshine magazine that derided local builders for their poor designs and craftsmanship. And this, of course, was in contrast to professionally trained architects like himself, who he stated, quote, "Life's work is one of responsibility and one that has an influence on the surroundings of generations after their day is over." MacLaren also wrote of design principles characteristic of the arts and crafts movement. In the Colorado Springs Gazette, he wrote an article which describes the necessity of observing the natural environment in creating regional architecture that is, quote, "beautiful and appropriate, architecture that looks as though it almost grew out of the ground, almost grew that almost as if it had grown out of the soil. So there's no doubt these gentlemen were arts and crafts architects. So we usually look at the arts and crafts movements and associate it in the United States with the East Coast, the Upper Midwest, and the West Coast. But the arts and crafts movement actually touched communities throughout the U.S. There were these artisan guilds that were created everywhere to help train artisans. So we know in the Pikes Peak region, you've got artist Van Briggle and the Van Briggle Pottery Company, R.L. Boatwell and the Craftswood Shops, and then of course these three gentlemen who were arts and crafts architects, all observing the tenets of the arts and craft movement. But whereas these artisans who created structures or created works out of clay or metal or textiles, they did this without any real regard to regionalism. The permanence and the environmental impact of architecture required architects to be more observant of local building traditions, to be true to the form of arts and crafts movement. Well, this would have been troublesome for these three gentlemen because they came to a place that had only been founded in 30 years. And so there was no local native Coloradan building tradition. I say that, there was no local European native building tradition, of course. So this was actually a benefit to them because this absence of a native architectural tradition allowed them to adapt and experiment with their designs. And they evolved and expanded their thoughts on the built environment in this young city. The result became architecture that combined the influence of their individualism, training, appreciation of and commitment to organic functional designs, and this eclectic mix of architecture developed. So here's some examples of this. Many of you will be familiar with these. Some of the commercial designs of MacLaren, Douglas, and Hetherington, and then also some of the residential designs here. Now what's interesting, one of the things I find interesting, we probably all familiar with craftsman homes that were the Sears and Roebuck's home, Aladdin homes, etc. These individuals would have been completely against the idea of Sears craftsman homes. These were, again, the arts and crafts movement was a counteraction to the Industrial Revolution. Aladdin and Sears company homes were absolutely mass-produced products of the Industrial Revolution. So they would have hated these. And MacLaren actually talks about these designs in some of his works. And he called the people that drafted these books as being, quote, men of as little education in the profession of architecture as are the owners for patent medicines in the medical sciences. So they did not like Sears and Roebuck's houses. But so they used some of these features that would become synonymous with craftsman architecture in their designs, but what they designed was actually more unique and more eclectic than these ubiquitous craftsman home designs. So what they did is they incorporated these features with historic styles, such as Queen Anne, Tudor, Spanish Colonial, Neoclassical, French Baroque. And again, as I stated before, arts and crafts architecture wasn't a specific kind of style, but rather an approach to design. So we're gonna take a deep dive look into a couple of these structures. I've had this conversation with people. Most of these structures, and if some of you are familiar with them, are in the Old North End, the Near North End, the Broadmoor area. I've had conversations with people about these structures, and they say, what kind of architecture is it? I mean, is it oh, I'm sorry. What kind of architecture is it? Is it craftsman? Is it Spanish colonial? Is it Tudor? And the answer is yes. And sometimes it's that all in one structure, right? And so that's what we see here. This is one of my favorites. We're going to look at a couple of my favorites. The All Souls Unitarian Church. This was designed by Douglas in 1892. And what Douglas did here was very consciously combine both American and Scottish architectural vernacular characteristics. So this would typically be considered an American shingle style structure, which is characterized by this deep gables, sloping gables, eyebrow dormers, a shallow roof overhang, and then of course the wooden shingling and the facade, American characteristics. And then Douglas incorporated unmistakable Scottish features here. The use of locally sourced stone, heavy along the foundation and base of the structure, as well as this interesting Normanesque tower which cuts through these cross gables. So he absolutely and consciously combined two different regional architectural styles in this structure. These two as well, these are that's the Pauline Chapel in the Broadmoor area, which was designed in partnership by MacLaren and Hetherington in 1918, and the Cragmore Sanatorium, which was designed by MacLaren in 1914. This is, of course, main hall at UCCS now. Now, MacLaren was very outspoken about the style of architecture that would be appropriate for the Pikes Peak region. Again, because the arts and crafts movement advocated styles that were congruent with the natural environment, it should look like the natural environment. MacLaren looked at the location of Colorado Springs, its natural features, and he advocated a style that would be very similar to the Italian or Spanish styles. Again, in Colorado Springs is almost latitudinally, it's about similar with where the Mediterranean is. So I think these are two very successful examples of this architecture. Interestingly, there was a young draftsman who worked for MacLaren in Colorado Springs named James Osborne Craig, and he was here between 1909 and 1914, and he'd be inspired by this style and help popularize it as the Spanish colonial style in Santa Barbara, California. So if you go to Santa Barbara, California and see Spanish colonial houses, they're rooted here in Colorado Springs in the work that Thomas MacLaren did. And last but not least, this is my favorite. This is the home of Thompson, Duncan, and Ann Hetherington at 218 East Columbia in the Old North End neighborhood, and this was designed by Hetherington in 1901. This was his family residence. And so what's interesting about this is he could have designed any kind of home he wanted to. He could have designed a Tudor home for himself, a Queen Anne home, but what he did here is he combined architectural characteristics from the three different regions. This is a bungalow-style home, which is it actually originates in the Indian subcontinent in India. The bungalow or Bangla-style home is characterized as a single family, 1 to 1.5 stories, long and narrow, with deep eaves and a large porch or veranda. So an Indian-style home. And then Hetherington incorporated unmistakable Scottish features. This, again, the use of heavy native stonework along the base, a wide arched entryway, asymmetrical balancing in the facade, what's called decorative half timbering and rough cast Harley infill, and Oriel windows, which are kind of like bay windows. And then, interestingly, very early, he incorporated features that would become synonymous with American craftsman architecture: L-brace brackets, square porch columns, mortise and tenon joints, and exposed roof rafters. So very conscious fusing of three different architectural characteristics from three different regions in a very eclectic structure done consciously because, again, he could have built any kind of home that he wanted to, but he chose to do that. I'm not sure, but I think this is either the first bungalow constructed in Colorado Springs or one of the first. Most bungalows in the United States were constructed from 1910 on. The case study of Thomas MacLaren, Walter Farquhar Douglas, and Thompson Duncan Hetherington illustrates that the effects of migration transcend man-made boundaries like the nation-state. Though the design philosophies that guided their work were unquestionably of British origin, they ultimately influenced and impacted the built environment in the young American frontier city of Colorado Springs. Individually in partnership, MacLaren, Douglas, and Hetherington designed at least 70 structures in the Pike Peak region, which still exist to this day. Of those, 16 are designated on the National Register of Historic Places, and 3 are on the Colorado State Register of Historic Places. These structures were and remain instrumental in the composition of Colorado Springs' built environment. They are structures truly rooted in the fundamental tenets of the British arts and crafts movement, and they endure as a link between the city of Colorado Springs' vibrant and unique past and its ever-evolving future. Thank you.